Welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to Implementation Science. I am Nanette Benbow, Co-Director of the Implementation Science Coordination, Consultation, and Collaboration Initiative at Northwestern University. I would like to acknowledge and thank the many colleagues who helped develop and inform the presentation, especially Juan Villamar, J.D. Smith, Hendrix Brown, Jen Brown, and Dennis Lee. Today I'll be presenting the basics of implementation science and the methods used in implementation science. I would like to start by defining what implementation science is and the key concepts in implementation science. Implementation science is a study of methods to promote the integration of evidence-based interventions, EBIs, into healthcare or public health practice and policy. Implementation science methods include frameworks, strategies, outcomes, metrics, and study designs. Frameworks are graphical or narrative representations of the key factors, concepts, and variables that explain the phenomenon of implementation. Implementation strategies are methods or techniques used to enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of an EBI program or practice. Implementation research is the scientific study of the use of strategies to adopt and integrate EBIs in real-world settings to improve patient outcomes and population benefit. Implementation is the use of strategies to adopt and integrate EBIs. Implementation science concepts and terminologies can be a bit overwhelming, so I present here in a non-scientific version of these definitions that was developed by Jeff Curran to capture the essence of what implementation science is and what it is trying to do. The intervention or practice or innovation is the thing. Effectiveness research looks at whether the thing works. Once we know it works, implementation research looks at how to best help people or places do the thing. Implementation strategies are the stuff we do to try to help people or places do the thing. Main implementation outcomes are how much and how well they do the thing. I will also be presenting a specific example throughout today's presentation using PrEP to facilitate understanding of these concepts. So I found this helpful when I was coming into implementation science. Hope this is helpful to you all as well. So why do we need implementation science? I think, I know I will be preaching to the choir many times throughout. You probably know this all too well. So we have a charge in ending ending the HIV epidemic, right? We have these 4 pillars. I am going to be focusing throughout this presentation using PrEP as an example to kind of help grasp these concepts. So, you know, the PrEP falls under protect people at risk for HIV using potent proven prevention interventions, including PrEP. So we have a charge. And we know where we're at, right? We know that sort of based on kind of most recent data, that while our 230 EHE goal is at 48% of people eligible for a PrEP or with indications for PrEP be on PrEP, we're right now only 12.6% of people are there. And this varies widely by race ethnicity. So Blacks, only 4% of Blacks indicated for PrEP or on PrEP or prescribed PrEP, 7.2 Hispanics, and 29.8 for whites. So we don't where it needs to be and not at the level that it needs to be. So to increase the beneficial impact of PrEP, we have to scale it out. We have to adapt and implement PrEP across different settings and across different populations. And we have to scale it up. We have to expand it so that it goes from that 12.6% to 4.8%, because right now it's only in certain settings, in certain states, et cetera. So, you know, it's been quite studied and documented that from when somebody has an idea of something that might work to when it kind of makes it into practice, that takes about 17 years. And that we just don't have time, you know, 2030 is around the corner, right? So we have to rush this process. And implementation science kind of brings the tools to do that. So just briefly, when you have an idea, you start with kind of some pre-intervention studies to try to get a sense of, how this would work, what it might look like. And then you have the question, could a program work? And that's what efficacy studies look at. Once you have a sense that it could work, then you actually want to study whether the program does work. And that is typically known as effectiveness studies. So when you hear of an evidence-based intervention, it's because it went through these two phases, and then it makes it in a journal article, and we know it works, and then we want to use it. But what is oftentimes missing is what is needed to make the program work, and that's where implementation science comes in. And in making the program work, there's various phases. There's kind of like, is this the program that I want? How do I prepare to implement this? What exactly do I need to do to implement it? And then what do I need to sustain it? So this is a cue, because what it's trying to illustrate here is once you have this intervention, a health department might, try to adopt it. They say, okay, I've got PrEP and I need to figure out all these things to get it into, to get it to people who are eligible. And when you do that, you might do some program evaluation, right? So that program evaluation, which we're all very familiar with, tells you whether that program worked for you in the particular environment in which you tried it out. Implementation science tries to now look at, let's not just look at one program, let's look at, there were multiple studies rolled out in different populations, looking at looking at slightly different tweaks, but most of them, and these color coded, does it work for different types of populations? So by around 2011, CDC released interim PrEP guidelines. They're like, this really holds promise. It's pretty much going to work. Let's start trying to figure out what the guidelines are for people to be able to use PrEP if they so choose. By 2012, we received FDA approval, and CDC in their health department notice of award in 2012 had PrEP as a recommended activity, not required, recommended. By 2014, CDC released the clinical practice guidelines, the final ones. And then in 2015, 2016, in 2015, kind of dissemination started. We had some early adopters of PrEP, and they were sharing their knowledge of what had worked for them. And, usually, that is how you find out about something and sort of what they did, and then you informally call them later on to try to get a sense of exactly how they handled thus and such thing to implement PrEP. So knowledge started to be shared there about people's experience of using PrEP, and then CDC's released two FOAs, 1506 and 1509, that were looking specifically at PrEP, and NIH had some PrEP supplements. By 2018, the CDC's kind of flagship funding for health departments, 1802, had PrEP as a required activity. So as you can see, 14 years went by from when we started thinking about this to when it was a required activity, but probably most health departments, I can tell you, I was at the health department around that time, knew we wanted to do it, but really didn't have a good sense of how to do it effectively. So what is implementation research doing? So I kind of mentioned, you have efficacy, you have effectiveness studies, and then implementation is kind of flipping the coin. It's like in effectiveness, we're trying to see, does the intervention impact individual health and health outcomes? In implementation, the intervention we know works, so it's taking kind of a back seat. And what we're looking at now is what is a system to support adoption and delivery with fidelity? And that's what it's focusing on. So then kind of, whereas in effectiveness, the people that you're focusing on are individuals, in implementation research, what you're focusing is on practitioners. The group of study are those who are implementing the evidence-based intervention. So I want to give you some examples of kind of what implementation research questions might look like. So for instance, What are the primary barriers and facilitators of implementing PrEP in local health departments? What does that look like? If you try to do it, what problems do you encounter, and what things facilitated being able to implement PrEP? Under what conditions does implementation of a strategy A work better, faster, or more efficiently than strategy B? So you might have two options or ways in which you might want to approach implementing. Which one is better? What are the characteristics of research, service, community partnerships that might help sustain this over time? So we're very used to in HIV research that that we have partnerships, that we have referrals. Some people do this, some people do something else. How well does that partnership work, and what is the contribution overall to implementation? And then does an implementation of strategy A or B more efficiently take PrEP to scale? So these are just some examples of implementation research questions that you might want to be. And I know for a fact that you all probably have a lot of these questions. You encounter them and you have these questions as you're trying to implement your EHE plans. So here, now I want to kind of help you again with, I told you what these things are, but now I'm going to try to give you examples to help illustrate what this says. So we have these frameworks, right? They kind of help sort of pictorially sort of describe the lay of the land of the world in which one is implementing something. Two common frameworks, there's many of them, but two common ones are called CFIR and EPIS, and I'll talk more about them. So you've got the framework, you identify what issues might be involved in implementation, and then given the issues, you're going to try to identify what strategies are going to help identify those issues. And then you're going to want to measure whether those strategies actually worked. And you're going to do that through the use of implementation outcomes. And this kind of outcomes, kind of these three boxes here illustrate that first you want to make sure that in the setting, what you wanted to do happened. And if it did happen well, then you're going to have some service outcomes, right? It's going to, you were able to do it effectively. You were able to reach everybody equally to get equity. You were able to do it in a timely way. And if you achieve those, then you're going to get the clinical outcomes of the initial evidence-based intervention. So as I mentioned, implementation research is kind of its area of focus are these settings and systems, right? So if we think about PrEP implementation, what might those be? So, you probably have encountered them. Clearly we start with PrEP eligible individuals. PrEP eligible individuals are identified through HIV testing systems. Those HIV testing systems are part of a healthcare system. That healthcare system is part of a broader social service system, and policy and legislation makes these things happen, and could at times hinder them. So for PrEP implementation, nationally, we have clearly CDC, who might partner with NIH, with HRSA in different ways to kind of try to see, how PrEP could be funded, what policies are needed at the national level to facilitate it. And they fund, kind of state and local public health departments. Advocacy groups play a key role nationally, researchers and policy experts. At the local level, we have city and statewide health departments who, receive CDC and HRSA funding to carry that out in their jurisdictions. So they might have a plan, they might have guidance, they already might be thinking of specific strategies, and they're facilitating this for people who they might fund, for agencies that they might fund. And then you have kind of the clinic-based sort of PrEP deliverer, right? That's sort of where the rubber hits the road. And ultimately, PrEP does need to be prescribed. You need to be monitored. It has to happen for many reasons in kind of a healthcare setting. So then you have kind of the clinic-based clinics. That could be STD clinics. It could be family planning, HIV primary care, other FQHCs, et cetera. And at these different levels, kind of different parts of the PrEP continuum of care are addressed. So this PrEP continuum, we know and love continuums, or we know and hate them, but they can be helpful kind of in understanding what are the different steps we need to achieve to get PrEP in the hands of everybody, right? So first, we need to identify who's at high risk. Those who are at risk need to know about this and recognize that it might be beneficial to them. Raise awareness of PrEP. So that's kind of creating awareness so people can come to the door and want this intervention, or know about it when they're told about it. Then there's uptake. So they know about it. They have to, once they know about it and want it, they have to know where to go and be able to get it. They have to, be prescribed PrEP and start PrEP. And then kind of adherence, right? So, they need to engage in behavior to adhere to PrEP. They need to be sure that they get continuous care to get PrEP, et cetera. So in awareness, social media and things might be one setting, right? That could be a sector that's in charge of that. Uptake is probably going to happen more at a clinic level, as is adherence and retention. So this is all to say that in these different settings, there might be different implementation questions. So here is an example that I'll be using a lot throughout, because I found it very helpful kind of in illustrating what are kind of the key elements of implementation. So the reason I thank Dawn Smith and Gretchen Weiss is they were brilliant in conducting a survey in 2015 of 500 local health departments. So these are county, city, local health departments. They had 284 respondents of these health departments, and they wanted to understand. So it's 2015. Remember my timeline, the guidelines came out in 14, 15, the PrEP guidelines. So people are ready. Some had done it. We had some early adopters, but people wanted to know, what do I do? So the idea was, let's start with a survey and see where local health departments are in thinking about a PrEP and in trying to implement it. So of 109, 38% of health departments at the time were engaged in providing PrEP implementation. So still, a small proportion of them, right? And 81% of these local health departments had an STD clinic. So a prime place to be able to do that. So those who are currently engaged in PrEP implementation was higher among local health departments who were serving a large population size. So kind of more like, local sort of urban clinics. And 45% expected of these health departments expected to expand PrEP. So they were doing something and thought they would expand it. 62% of local health departments were not currently engaged in PrEP, and 58% of them operated a clinic. So they had a place, but they hadn't done anything yet. For those not currently engaged, they tended to be smaller, medium-sized jurisdictions. And 13% expected to initiate PrEP in the next 14 years, and about half of them were undecided or unlikely to initiate PrEP. So really kind of not ready to go down there, didn't have resources, a whole host of good reasons, but they just weren't there yet in 2015. So this really gives you a sense, one, of where are people and what issues are they encountering as they're even thinking about implementing PrEP. So among the health departments who were currently engaged in PrEP implementation, they were asked, so what is it that you were doing? And about 75% of them were just referring high-risk individuals to PrEP. That's, low-hanging. I know this works. I know people who provide this. I'm just going to help them get to that, because often, as mentioned, many of these had STD clinics, were encountering high risk, but were just referring. Others were conducting community education and outreach, so kind of addressing the awareness part of the cascade. Others were developing PrEP referral sites, so maybe they didn't have places to whom they could refer PrEP clients to, and they were trying to identify who those people could be and sort of what referral might look like. Only 10% of these were actually delivering PrEP at their health department clinic. They probably, this was new and they just had not kind of had the time to really think about how to incorporate this in their clinical site. So it sort of just as a kind of as a parenthesis to this, imagine that if in 2015, these clinics kind of, these are health departments who were engaged in PrEP. Imagine if they had the tools and knew what the best way was to incorporate PrEP into their clinic. They would have adopted it much earlier, and probably more than 10% of them. So again, just kind of illustrating the value of kind of results from implementation research. So I just want to briefly get into the consolidated framework for implementation research. And, the picture seems complicated and there's lots of moving parts, but you all know these complexities all too well. So for instance, as you're trying to implement something, that there are going to be things like, if we think about your clinic, things within your clinic that are going to be difficult. There's going to be outer setting things that are difficult. So, how are we going to pay for PrEP? Can everybody who wants PrEP afford it? Do they have health insurance? Those are just a couple of examples of the many different complicated things that you can encounter when you're trying to implement. So CFR divides this into kind of 5 general domains. The characteristics of the intervention. So what are the steps required for individuals to move through the PrEP continuum? What are kind of the essential elements of the intervention that need to happen and that we need to define? Inner setting, or what are the factors that reflect what is happening within settings where PrEP will be implemented? So, what is the staffing level? What are the policies and procedures of the clinic that will allow or facilitate that? What is kind of the organizational culture? So, hey, there's this new intervention. Do you want to adopt it? Well, maybe not everybody does. There are kind of cultures that are more open to change or not. Outer setting are external factors influencing implementation success. So, for instance, state laws dictating who can be offered PrEP. So, initially it wasn't clear whether adolescents could be on PrEP or not. That has since been ironed out. How is it going to be paid? Does Medicaid cover for, pay for it, et cetera? Early on, that was not known. And if you wanted to implement PrEP and you didn't have these things, then you had to address these issues, right? Then individuals are there, the individual's domain considers those who are involved with the intervention or the implementation process. So it's both people in need of PrEP and what are kind of their attitudes about PrEP and knowledge of PrEP. And the other is that of staff. And do staff believe in PrEP? Do they know what it is? Do they know how they need to react to these things? And then process, which represents the combination of activities involved in planning, engaging, and executing PrEP. So what CFR does is it has a host of questions. They have a great website called www.cfarguide.org, and you'll get a copy of all of these slides, by the way. And it has this sort of all these questions that you can go through, identify which ones you want to really hone in on as you're trying to think about implementing something. So before you implement, identify what the barriers and facilitators are going to be to implementing your evidence-based practice. The EPIS model, which stands for Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment, also considers these outer settings, inner settings. It also considers all these barriers, but it recognizes that there are stages, and at different stages you might encounter different barriers and facilitators. So just to give you an example from the survey that I just mentioned of local health departments, among 52 local health departments who were not implementing PrEP at the time, you kind of had to motivate the 41% that are not currently interested, right? So that's kind of in the exploration phase. These are the things you need to do to even get started. You need to help the 46% that are contemplating, who said they might be considering expanding PrEP. And then in the preparation phase, you want to support the 13 who said They really wanted to, but, we're kind of still trying to figure it out. And then among the 38 local health departments who were already implementing, so they're in the implementation phase, they were running into perhaps issues of, data monitoring. How do we measure the success? How do we, measure and fine tune our system and improve delivery and ultimately sustainment of PrEP? So just to give you a kind of going back to our survey as an example, local health departments were asked, like, what challenges are you encountering in PrEP implementation? And these answers were compared for those who were not engaged versus those who were engaged, right? So already these not engaged and engaged are kind of at a slightly different point in their thinking of sort of how to carry out the intervention. So some indicated they were unsure about what the health department could or should do to support PrEP. So if they weren't offering it directly, like, what could they do? This was a challenge for those who were engaged, less of a challenge for those who weren't engaged. So this is about the particular process of how do we get PrEP, right? In terms of outer context, the issues that they described was they were concerned about inadequate third-party reimbursement. So what if we bring people and we're promoting PrEP, but then we don't have a way to pay for it? So, in my state, that isn't paid for or isn't covered. An important one was concern about financial access to PrEP, again, and lack of healthcare providers willing to provide PrEP. So that was an issue, and 46% of those were engaged. If you think of an STD clinic, you have providers there, well aware of risk and, of treatment of STDs, but not that knowledgeable about how to help and facilitate PrEP. So these are, again, examples. I won't go through all of them, but how different issues of process, outer, inner, and individual domains of CFIR are going to vary depending on whether people are engaged or not engaged. So then, we identified all these challenges that I just mentioned. And so how do we address those challenges? I want to implement this. I know what the issues are. I know what the problems are. How do I address them? And how to address them in a way that I know is going to work. All of you have great ideas and you probably have a lot of experience of what works. So you might be well on your way. But if you're really kind of new to this, then maybe you do want to rely on other effective strategies that have been that are tried and true. So remember, strategies are these methods or techniques that are used to adopt, implement, and sustain an evidence-based intervention. Again, I like kind of the super lay way of describing strategies, which is the stuff we do to try to help people do the thing. And Powell and colleagues have done an extensive study of strategies that work. And oftentimes these strategies that work, they work across settings, right? A clinical setting shares many problems, regardless of whether you're trying to implement PrEP or trying to, implement EPT or, trying to, address cardiovascular disease prevention. The problems in a clinical setting are going to be the same, right? So they did a study of implementation of evidence-based interventions, and they identified about 70 different types of strategies that seem to work in various settings. And then they decided to kind of group them. And in grouping them, they identified kind of these, like, I think there are 9 different categories that, came together and seemed to be addressing the same issues. So the big green one, for instance, is develop stakeholder interrelationships. So for instance, if we think about of our health department STD clinic health department setting, they were what they were saying is we're going to be referring out. So what do we need to do to effectively refer out? What are strong interrelationships? What are agreements are needed? What are really good ways of partnering with others to have a really strong referral? So these strategies, are really, there are a number you can identify, and these are the ones that you're going to test in implementation research. So one thing that J.D. Smith, Dennis Lee, and other colleagues of mine looked at is, we were trying to determine what are other like HIV related common strategies. So we looked at, recently funded HIV studies, NIH funded studies that were doing implementation, and we tried to identify the strategies. So that's what we show here, and you're going to recognize these strategies, right? So a lot of them tend to use, we're looking and measuring adaptation of interventions and tailoring specific implementation strategies. So little tweaks to the strategies in different settings, or trying to see how care coordination and care integration might help kind of facilitate an HIV evidence-based intervention. Peer-led delivery support, incentives. So these are strategies that you know well, and I think we still need to understand the level at which each one of these strategies kind of can contribute to good implementation. Going back to our PrEP implementation activities, among those who were engaged in PrEP, remember, many of them were referring high-risk individuals to PrEP, right? 75% of them, that's what they were doing. So for those who are implementing PrEP in that way, that's how they're carrying out PrEP. One thing you could ask yourself is, can adding support of a peer navigator improve referral rates? So you're an STD clinic, you identified somebody at high risk, you've got a good PrEP provider. Will a peer navigator type strategy really help seal the deal and make sure that the person in need of PrEP gets contacted to a provider? Or if they were delivering PrEP at a health department clinic, one strategy that you might want to explore is, can integrating PrEP into an STD clinic improve uptake and adherence? So again, types of strategies that you might want to look at. So other potential strategies along the PrEP continuum, and these are just some that we came up with. I'm sure you all have many other ideas. Is, for instance, in awareness, like, are there outreach strategies to potential users through PrEP ambassadors, right? So social network strategies have been shown to be effective in terms of reaching out to people to promote HIV testing, for instance. Maybe using this type of strategy to have PrEP ambassadors might work. If you want to address the uptake part of the PrEP continuum, maybe some sort of an mHealth technology for peer navigators to promote initiation and adherence of PrEP. Identification of PrEP eligible clients through ER or provider education to increase provision of PrEP. Adherence and retention, or automated appointment reminders, perhaps, could we tailor them in such a way in which people, are reminded to take their medications or, meet their 3-month appointments for PrEP? Anyway, some examples of the type of strategies you might want to consider. So I think I mentioned these research, these different types of outcomes that you want in implementation research. And I just want to focus on the implementation outcomes, which really have to do, you have an intervention, you have a strategy. It's only going to work if people find it acceptable. And by people, I mean the provider and the client, right? If you have a really effective intervention, like a bad tasting pill that has lots of side effects, that's not going to be very acceptable to clients. And you're just not going to be able to do that unless you come up with some really good strategies. So it's important that you measure whether it was acceptable, if it's likely to be adopted. In the example of the STD clinic, like, is it something that even goes naturally in their flow? And if not, what do you need to do? So if you do it successfully, then it was adopted, it was appropriate. The cost associated to it, is it feasible? And then you want to make sure that if you did indeed, when you implemented it, you want to make sure that you kept fidelity so that that those outcomes of an evidence-based intervention if you applied the intervention with fidelity, you will continue getting those outcomes. So these implementation outcomes are key, and you're going to measure them among the group of, service providers or people within a setting, and whether it worked. So just some example of implementation outcomes. I won't go through all of them, but acceptability, for instance, if you want to measure that. Acceptability, as I mentioned, is going to happen both at the individual level and at the provider level. So you want something that you could look at, for instance, is the perception among STD clinic providers that PrEP is effective. Do they think it's effective? Can it be delivered in a clinic with acceptable level of complexity? Feasibility, that can happen at the individual provider or organization setting. So that could be something like trying to measure sort of the perception that PrEP can be successfully carried out within the STD clinic. What do people think about that? They need to believe that it's feasible in order for them to even want to adopt such a thing. So again, you'll get these slides. Here are some examples of implementation outcomes. Just really briefly, if for you all who kind of understand, there's randomized controlled trials, there's, kind of retrospective and prospective studies to try to identify if an intervention is efficacious or effective. Well, those designs also exist to try to see if strategies are effective, which is the goal of implementation research. So listed here are a whole bunch of different typical study designs that could be used to measure the effectiveness of implementation strategies. I want to just really kind of touch really briefly on partnerships, because it really is an essential part to implementation research. And fortunately, partnerships are central to these NIH-funded EHE supplements. And, thank God you all are here and you are an integral part of this research. The actual grant requested that it be based, that the partnership be formed and that partners help identify and inform the research, and that the research be based on questions relevant to partners. So it's at the heart of this, and, investigators, probably had these partnerships. You probably already knew your research partners, and it was, a good match that was formed, bringing together these different types of sort of the practitioners and the researchers. I just want to say and recognize here kind of these, theories, models, and frameworks of implementation science. All of them recognize the importance of partnerships. Partnerships are key in the inner setting. They're key in kind of in the, implementation phase of EPIS. And they are key, clearly in established in community-based participatory research. So partnerships is an implementation strategy. And remember, as I highlighted in this, big compendium of strategies, developing stakeholder interrelationships was a key strategy. So this partnership that you all are a part of is really central. And I want to highlight how central this is. I think community engaged research really kind of describes this very well. And that is, it's the bidirectional exchange of expertise between academics and communities. Defined local, cultural practice, lived experience experts, to increase the value of research for improving health equity and equity. So this bidirectional exchange, I can't emphasize enough. It's, you all know what the problem is. Your population well. Where where barriers and facilitators are, and what needs need to be met by your clients, by your constituents, by your city residents or state residents. Researchers have a good idea of how to study that, have a good idea perhaps of the evidence base, have a good idea of what things might have worked in the past. And And throughout the research process, from developing the research question to implementing the actual research and then interpreting the findings, is something where where the partnership is constantly communicating. So, in summary, I think we've identified what implementation science is. It's a science that focuses on understanding and informing effective implementation. So again, not what works for one health department, but what seems to work for a group of health departments, is the example of the STD clinics. Once implementation research identifies some clear strategies for STD clinics, all STD clinics throughout the country could use it, right? So studying what works for all is really valuable in the long run to scale things up, to be able to implement PrEP in all STD clinics, of which there are many in the country, and the same could be said about FQHCs for other HIV interventions. Expanding the use of implementation science to shorten the time between intervention development, testing, and applying it in real-world settings, and harnessing the partnership of which you all are part of. And then an important part, which I've not been able to get into, but that also exists in implementation science, is kind of dissemination. And that is, you've identified what strategies work. How do we get the word out there to all the STD clinics, to all the FQHCs, to all the health departments engaged in an intervention? How do we communicate that so they are ready to adopt both the intervention and the strategies needed to implement it? So that's it for this presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I wanted to open this up to questions, and then I have a couple of questions for you all. Questions, comments?
Hi, Nanette. This is Juan. You can folks can unmute themselves if they want to directly on using Zoom, or if they're on their phone.
Hi, this is Amy Nunn. Thank you so much. In terms of what I think would be useful, I've been in this collaborative for this is my second year, and I've learned a lot. What has been most instructive for me is getting the tutorials around my own grant submissions and the logic model, which helps me just think through logically. And I think the more that we see those kinds of examples applied to HIV, because there have actually been so few published, seeing more examples of other people's, from articles to grants to logic models, and then also just getting ad hoc tutorials when we get to a stumbling block about how to frame things. I find that we're generally measuring all the right stuff, but where we get tripped up is in the nomenclature and how to package the things in terms of the frameworks and the process. Yeah, and thank you very much for the opportunity to continue participating.
Sure, thanks, Amy. And indeed, I made this presentation using PrEP as an example before, and it's very helpful for people to kind of have a clear understanding of, something that they can relate to. So one of the things that we would really like to do are case studies, and kind of applying to a case study all the different types of frameworks, methods, and strategies to that. That, probably more detail will be needed, but I think that's a good first start. So we will continue assembling those packages, Amy.
Thank you.
So please feel free to ask questions as they come about. And I realize you might still be trying to digest this. And I want you all to feel free to contact me if you, like, at any point have questions about, once you see these slides, you have a question, feel free to shoot me or Juan Villamud an email, and that will be in the presentation, that will be in the slides that you get. But in order to really provide good implementation science support to partners, our goal is that partners are well-versed enough in implementation research that they can have implementation research speak with their research partners. and to facilitate this dialogue that needs to happen throughout the entire implementation research process. So we want to identify kind of where your current knowledge is of implementation research, what you would like to know more about, and how you think implementation research can help you moving forward. So if you could take a look at these three, based on what you learned today, and thinking about, the specific EHE project that you're involved in, or your local EHE plan. So I'm sure, all of you have a state, local EHE plan of sorts, or the national one. You're trying to, address some key priorities that you have. How can implementation research help you with that? So please, I welcome any input that can help us guide what support we might give you all. Please don't be shy. Thoughts, comments? Do you see? I can tell you when I was at the health department before moving to Northwestern, I learned about implementation research, and I was very intrigued by it because I thought I knew very well why things did not work. I had seen many interventions that kind of went to die in implementation. And I was really fascinated. I'm like, what? There's this science that can help me figure this out? And I had lots of questions of things that I wanted to figure out. So I'm sure you all do too. And if you feel comfortable sharing now what you think on these three questions, that would be welcome. And if not, stay tuned, because we will be sending out a needs assessment to try to understand this, so we can in order to guide our implementation support. Any comments, suggestions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Barry, and I work for the Health Department in Massachusetts. Our EHE jurisdiction is Suffolk County, which includes the city of Boston and two smaller cities and a town just north of Boston. And I have more of a comment, I think, but also a question. With our EHE plan, our advisors gave us really concrete, and we sought concrete advice on what we can do better with the populations that we're trying to serve. And it's our mindset is that we developed this plan, we have a set of activities and a timeline. And we're going to be, we're starting implementation this month. And we want to course correct as quickly as possible when something isn't working that we sought out to do. So I guess I'm trying to balance, how do you act readily with advisory from real experience working with vendors that are doing the work, with the practice of understanding how to be successful through this model. So I think that's a challenge, I guess I'm raising. Like, how do we respect the science, respect the development process, but sometimes we don't have the time to actually wait for how it's best done to actually start doing something. So I guess there's some tension there with how do we act affirmatively with what we're learning and benefit from the science?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Barry, that's a great question. Recognizing kind of that oftentimes researchers and practitioners are on a totally different time scale, right? And, right now there's talk about kind of rapid implementation. And how do you do that? How can you achieve that? And I think there is, the more going in, the more of these barriers and facilitators that before you go into it, the more kind of you have a sense, one, you've addressed them ahead of time, or that they might be rearing their ugly head end later on, right? But there are strategies that kind of have this rapid feedback of what's working and what's not. And actually in EPIS, although it's phased, there is a lot of communication between implementation and sustainment. So, there's these plan, study, do, act cycles. I think this is sort of where CQI really kind of has good models of how to achieve that. How to use groups, and how to, do it routinely, kind of fast pace CQI.
Yeah.
You could focus on a certain questions, but use kind of more of these rapid cycles.
Yeah. This is a thank you for pointing this out. This is an interesting model, because for us, we have a steering committee made up of 60 people who we're accountable to around the implementation of EHG work, and we want to use data, but we also want to use the practice experience of the staff doing this work, and so we plan to have a continuous kind of, what does the data tell us? What is the status of the program tell us? What are our linkage? Are our rates getting any better? Are we helping people better?
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for pointing this out to me again, because I think this is a great framework to kind of see our future implementation work.
Yeah, and Barry, thank you for this question, because I just gave you, 2 tidbits of what might work. What we envision is that through the implementation support we give you, we'll be able to give you more concrete examples of how to do this. So thank you. It is on our list. So stay tuned, more to come.
Sure thing. Thanks so much. And I think that EHE gives us a chance to do things quickly, but we don't want to just act to act. We want to act with some reason to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Barry. Any other questions, comments? So